The rise and decline of world powers follow long-term cycles that may look complex on the surface, but once you zoom out and observe them across centuries, the same patterns repeat with remarkable consistency. These patterns are driven by a combination of debt accumulation, productivity trends, education, innovation, military strength, and the global demand for a nation's currency. When a country begins its ascent, it usually starts with strong leadership, a culture that values hard work, and a system that rewards innovation. Productivity rises because people are educated, motivated, and aligned around a common mission. This leads to economic growth, allowing the country to build wealth, strengthen institutions, and earn global respect. Over time, as its economy becomes dominant, its currency becomes widely used in global trade, giving it unmatched financial advantages. This early stage is where discipline is highest and debt tends to be lowest, because growth is primarily fueled by productivity, not borrowing. But as a nation becomes wealthier, people's mindsets change. Success creates comfort, which often turns into complacency. Standards weaken, expectations rise, and the discipline that once fueled growth begins to fade. Borrowing increases as governments and individuals expand their lifestyles beyond what productivity alone can sustain. Debt becomes a substitute for real economic strength, artificially inflating living standards and creating the illusion of prosperity. This process often takes decades, and because it unfolds slowly, most people don't notice the underlying deterioration. They assume the dominance will continue indefinitely because they mistake short-term stability for long-term health. As debt grows and productivity plateaus, the country begins to lose its competitive edge. Other nations, often hungrier and more disciplined, rise by investing in education, manufacturing, and innovation. These emerging powers follow the same early-stage behaviors that the dominant power once embodied. Meanwhile, internal divisions grow within the leading country as wealth gaps widen. When the pie stops growing, people fight more aggressively over the slices. Political polarization intensifies, institutions weaken, and trust declines. These internal fractures further reduce the country's ability to deal with external challenges, creating a feedback loop of decline. Eventually, the world recognizes that the leading nation's currency is no longer as strong or reliable as it once was. Confidence erodes. Foreign buyers reduce their holdings. The country prints more money to manage debt, which devalues the currency even further. In every historical case, this shift accelerates the decline because financial power is the backbone of global influence. Once a currency loses its reserve status, even gradually, the country loses a major advantage that previously allowed it to borrow cheaply and control global trade dynamics. At the same time, the rising power continues to strengthen. It becomes more innovative, more productive, and more economically influential. It gains global respect and begins attracting foreign investment that once flowed to the declining power. Over many decades, the balance shifts. Sometimes the transition is peaceful, other times it leads to economic conflict, technological competition, or even military tension. But regardless of how the transition unfolds, the underlying mechanics remain the same. A disciplined, productive, unified country rises, becomes wealthy, grows comfortable, accumulates debt, loses its competitive spirit, experiences internal conflict, and eventually declines. Meanwhile, another country goes through the opposite path, climbing steadily upward. Understanding these cycles allows individuals, businesses, and nations to avoid being blindsided by changes that appear sudden but have actually been building for decades. The advantage goes to those who study history, recognize patterns, and prepare for the shifts in global power that are as inevitable as the seasons themselves. Internal order and unity form the foundation upon which any nation's long-term strength depends, and when you examine history through an objective, pattern-based lens, you see that countries do not fail primarily because of external enemies, but because they fracture from within. A nation can face economic challenges, competitive pressure, or geopolitical threats and still remain strong if its people are aligned, if institutions function effectively, and if there is a shared sense of purpose. But when unity erodes, even the most powerful societies become vulnerable in ways that are subtle at first and then painfully obvious. Internal order is not about forced obedience or blind nationalism. It is about having systems that people trust, leaders they believe in, and fairness that keeps the majority invested in the future. When governments operate predictably, when laws are applied consistently, and when citizens feel that the system works for them, stability increases naturally. This stability becomes a kind of national capital, something that produces benefits quietly yet continuously. As nations grow richer and more successful, maintaining this internal unity becomes increasingly difficult. Wealth gaps begin to widen, not because anyone intends it, but because markets reward different skills and behaviors unequally. Over time, the gap between the haves and the have-nots turns from a simple economic difference into a psychological divide. Trust in the system starts to fade among those who feel left behind, while those who benefit from prosperity often underestimate how fragile social cohesion really is. When people believe the system is unfair, resentment builds. That resentment evolves into political polarization, social fragmentation, and eventually a breakdown of cooperation. Historical cycles repeatedly show that nations collapse into chaos not when they are poor, but when they become too unequal. The more people fight over how resources should be distributed, the less energy remains for innovation, development, and unity. Strong nations throughout history were those that managed to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. They created incentives for people to work hard, innovate, and pursue their own success, but they also maintained systems that supported social stability and provided opportunities for upward mobility. When people trust that effort leads to advancement, unity grows naturally. When people feel that no matter how hard they work, they cannot improve their position, unity dissolves. Once trust begins to erode, institutions come under increasing stress. Laws are questioned, leaders are criticized more intensely, and public discourse becomes more combative. Instead of cooperating to solve shared problems, groups compete to win ideological battles. This stage is one of the most dangerous in the national cycle, because emotional decision-making replaces rational, principle-driven thinking. At this point, external pressures amplify internal weaknesses. Rising powers see an opportunity and become more assertive. Economies slow down, giving people more reasons to blame each other. Productivity declines as energy is spent on conflict rather than creation. In some historical transitions, this internal division escalated into violence or civil unrest. In others, it simply caused a long, steady decline in global influence. But the pattern remains constant. Internal disorder is the beginning of national vulnerability. Once a society cannot coordinate effectively, it becomes far easier for external competitors to overtake it. Unity does not mean avoiding disagreement. Disagreements are natural and even healthy when managed constructively. Unity means having mechanisms, political, legal, cultural, that allow disagreement to be processed productively rather than destructively. Nations that thrive during transitions are those that face their internal problems honestly. They strengthen institutions, reduce inequality, promote fairness, and reinforce the shared values that brought them success in the first place. They look at reality clearly, acknowledge the cracks forming within their system, and take corrective action before those cracks expand into fractures that threaten the entire structure. Understanding this principle is essential because the strength of any nation at any moment in history is less about its wealth or military might and more about its ability to remain cohesive during periods of change. When people remain united, nations prosper. When unity breaks down, decline becomes inevitable, regardless of how powerful they once were. Excessive debt and money printing weaken a nation slowly at first, and then all at once, following a pattern that has repeated across empires for centuries. When a country is rising, debt tends to be used productively, invested in infrastructure, education, innovation, and things that increase future income. This kind of borrowing strengthens a nation because the returns exceed the cost. But over time, as success turns into entitlement and governments try to satisfy growing demands, debt becomes a tool of convenience rather than strategy. Instead of being used to build the future, it begins to be used to fund lifestyles, plug budget deficits, and delay difficult decisions. This marks the beginning of a dangerous cycle in which borrowing grows faster than the ability to repay. At first, the consequences seem manageable because people become accustomed to prosperity and ignore the warning signs, believing the good times will continue indefinitely. As debt piles up, governments face a choice: reduce spending, raise taxes, or create money. The first two are unpopular, so leaders often choose the easiest option: printing more money, or its modern equivalent, quantitative easing. This temporarily eases financial pressure, making it seem like a harmless solution. But every time new money is created without a corresponding increase in productivity, the value of the existing currency weakens. People feel it gradually as the cost of living rises, savings lose purchasing power, and financial markets become distorted. What many don't realize is that this stage has happened countless times before. It is the same process that contributed to the decline of the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, and every major reserve currency throughout history. Money printing is political sugar. It feels good in the short term, but creates long-term fragility. Eventually, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Debt reaches levels where even small increases in interest rates become dangerous because the government must borrow more money just to pay interest on its previous borrowing. Investors, both domestic and international, begin to lose confidence in the currency and the government's ability to manage its finances. When confidence erodes, people start protecting themselves. They move money into assets like real estate, gold, stocks, or foreign currencies. This behavior accelerates the decline of the national currency. Once trust begins to break, it rarely reverses easily. Even slight doubts can trigger major consequences because a currency is only as strong as the belief people have in it. As the currency weakens, inflation rises, sometimes slowly and sometimes rapidly. Everyday people feel this most painfully because their incomes rarely grow as fast as prices. Inequality increases as those who hold financial assets get wealthier, while those dependent on wages struggle more. This fuels social tensions and political conflict, which further weakens confidence in the system. At this stage, governments often print even more money to provide relief, fund programs, or stabilize markets. But each intervention reinforces the cycle of weakening currency and rising debt. It becomes a self-perpetuating loop that accelerates the decline of national strength. Eventually, global markets take notice. Countries that rely heavily on foreign investors or foreign buyers of their bonds find themselves vulnerable when those investors decide the risks are too high. Demand for the currency falls, borrowing costs rise, and the financial system becomes strained. Historically, the final stage of this cycle is a major restructuring of the economy, which can involve defaults, currency resets, or dramatic shifts in political leadership. Some nations recover through disciplined reforms, others collapse into prolonged stagnation or instability. The key point is that excessive debt and uncontrolled money creation have never been sustainable for any major power. Without exception, they erode economic foundations and signal the transition from dominance to decline. Understanding this principle helps individuals and nations prepare for the inevitable adjustments that follow periods of financial excess. Debt and money printing are powerful tools when used wisely, but when abused, they slowly undermine the very systems they are meant to support, leading to consequences that appear sudden but have been building for decades. Shifts in global power are strongly influenced by technological change and transformations in how wealth is created and distributed. And when you look across centuries of history, you see that technology is often the catalyst that reshapes the hierarchy of nations. Every major empire rose because it mastered the technologies of its era, whether it was navigation and shipbuilding for the Dutch, industrial machinery for the British, or digital and financial innovation for the United States. Technology increases productivity, competitiveness, and military strength, giving nations that lead in innovation a decisive edge. But as new technologies emerge, the balance begins to shift toward countries that adapt faster, invest more intentionally, and cultivate a culture of learning and experimentation. Those that cling to old systems lose momentum, while those that embrace change begin to rise. Technological revolutions don't just create new industries, they rewrite the rules of global competition. As technology evolves, the distribution of wealth also changes. Entire classes of workers and businesses benefit from each new wave of innovation while others fall behind. Nations that manage this transition effectively, by educating their people, retraining their workforce, and ensuring broad access to opportunity, tend to maintain stability and continue rising. But when technology advances faster than society can adapt, inequality widens. Wealth becomes concentrated among those who understand, control, or have access to new technologies. This fuels resentment and deepens the divide between economic winners and losers. Over time, this internal imbalance becomes more than a social issue, it becomes a national weakness. Nations that fail to create inclusive opportunities lose internal unity, which reduces their ability to compete globally. Meanwhile, rising powers often build their strength by aggressively adopting and improving on technologies created by others. They invest heavily in research, education, and industrial policy. They study global systems carefully and find strategic openings. Over time, their capabilities expand, and they begin challenging the dominant power in key industries, first quietly, then openly. This shift can be seen in manufacturing, artificial intelligence, cyber technology, energy, and finance. Once the rising power achieves parity in innovation, the old power structure begins to crack. The leading nation finds itself spending more energy defending its position rather than advancing forward. Historical cycles show that countries rarely lose their place because they stop being smart, they lose it because they stop being hungry. Technological shifts also reshape military power. Innovations in weaponry, intelligence systems, communication networks, and cyber capabilities redefine what it means to be strong. Nations that lead in these areas protect their interests more effectively and project influence across the world. But when an emerging power begins matching or surpassing the dominant nation in these fields, the global balance becomes unstable. Competition intensifies not just economically but strategically. Tensions rise, alliances shift, and nations prepare for a world in which old assumptions are no longer reliable. This stage of transition is often misunderstood by the public because the changes are subtle at first. Trade disputes, cybersecurity conflicts, investment restrictions, sanctions. But together they signal that a deeper geopolitical realignment is underway. The critical point is that technological change does not happen in isolation. It links directly to education, productivity, military power, economic influence, and currency strength. When a nation leads in these areas, its global power expands naturally because the world depends on its innovations, its financial systems, and its stability. But when it falls behind or becomes complacent, those advantages erode. As other countries catch up, the dominant nation's share of global trade declines, foreign investment shifts elsewhere, and the international community begins adjusting to a new center of gravity. This cycle is neither good nor bad. It is simply the mechanics of how world orders evolve. Understanding it helps people avoid emotional reactions and instead see the transition as part of a larger pattern. Nations rise by mastering the technologies of their time and fall when they stop adapting to new ones. Those that remain open to innovation, invest in their people, and adapt to global shifts can maintain strength even during turbulent transitions. Those that don't inevitably lose influence, not because of fate, but because they fail to align themselves with the forces shaping the future. Conflict becomes far more likely when a nation loses harmony between its people, institutions, and economic systems, and this pattern has been consistent throughout history. When the internal fabric of a country weakens, disagreements that once could be resolved through dialogue or compromise begin to escalate into ideological, economic, or even physical confrontation. At the root of this growing conflict is usually a breakdown of trust. People lose faith in the fairness of the system, institutions lose credibility, and groups that once coexisted peacefully start viewing each other as threats rather than fellow citizens. As economic pressures increase and political divisions widen, the emotions of fear, anger, and frustration override rational judgment. This shift from cooperation to confrontation marks one of the most dangerous phases in the national cycle because it signals that internal stability is unraveling. Conflict does not arise suddenly. It builds gradually, often beginning with subtle cultural shifts. People start to group themselves more strongly by identity, ideology, or economic class. Media becomes polarized, conversations become more hostile, and public debate becomes less about solving shared problems and more about defeating opposing viewpoints. When a society's ability to have constructive disagreement is lost, every issue becomes a battleground. Political leaders in such environments often amplify these divisions intentionally or unintentionally, because appealing to fear or anger becomes an easier way to gain support than appealing to unity or reason. Over time, this dynamic creates an environment where compromise is seen as weakness and where winning becomes more important than progress. Economic pressures intensify this fragmentation. When economic growth slows, when debt rises, or when costs of living become unbearable, people look for someone to blame. Those at the bottom of the wealth ladder feel left behind and manipulated. Those at the top feel targeted and misunderstood. Institutions like courts, media, and governments become battlegrounds for competing interests. Each decision is interpreted through the lens of bias, corruption, or injustice. This erosion of trust makes it increasingly difficult for leaders to govern and for institutions to function effectively. Policies that could stabilize the nation become nearly impossible to implement because agreement becomes rare. As a result, problems worsen, dissatisfaction grows, and conflict escalates. History shows that declining nations almost always experience a surge in internal or external conflict. When internal unity collapses, external adversaries sense vulnerability and seize opportunities to expand influence or challenge the dominant power. This can lead to trade wars, cyber conflicts, territorial disputes, espionage, or military tension. Even if these conflicts do not escalate into full-scale war, they drain resources, damage economic confidence, and further divide the population. In some cases, governments facing internal turmoil attempt to shift attention outward by framing external rivals as existential threats. This can temporarily unite the population, but it often leads to long-term strategic mistakes as decisions are driven by emotion rather than logic. At the same time, the breakdown of harmony between institutions and economic systems creates inefficiencies that make recovery increasingly difficult. Government agencies may work against each other rather than together. Political parties block policies not based on merit, but based on rivalry. Courts may be viewed as biased and media may be seen as partisan. As trust fades across every level of society, people begin relying more on alternative sources of authority, interest groups, extremist movements, or charismatic leaders promising simple solutions to complex problems. These shifts further weaken the institutions that maintain stability. Once a society reaches this stage, even small triggers can cause large-scale conflict. Protests escalate into riots, political disagreements escalate into legal battles, and economic stress escalates into widespread frustration. What makes this phase particularly dangerous is that both the public and leadership often underestimate how quickly disorder can accelerate. Stability is maintained not just by laws or military power, but by the shared belief that the system works. When that belief erodes, maintaining order requires increasing force, and force rarely resolves conflict, it deepens it. Despite the severity of these patterns, history also shows that nations can overcome internal conflict if they confront reality honestly, reduce inequality, rebuild trust, and reinforce fair and effective institutions. Renewal requires humility, adaptation, and a willingness to place long-term stability over short-term victory. Nations that succeed in doing this emerge stronger and more united. Those that fail become examples of how internal division can destroy even the greatest powers in the world. Adapting with clear principles, data-driven thinking, and historical awareness becomes essential during times of major global transition because uncertainty increases, emotions intensify, and many people act reactively rather than thoughtfully. When the world order shifts, the old rules stop working as they once did, and relying on intuition alone becomes dangerous. Principles serve as a compass that keeps individuals and nations aligned with reality. Even when circumstances become confusing or stressful, they provide a framework for decision making that is grounded not in impulse, but in logic, evidence, and long-term perspective. Ray Dalio's approach emphasizes that the people and countries who thrive during turbulent periods are those who step back, observe patterns, remove ego, and respond rationally to what is happening rather than what they wish were happening. This mindset allows them to see threats early, act with agility, and seize opportunities that others overlook because they are trapped in panic or denial. Data plays a powerful role in this process. In moments of transition, opinions often overwhelm facts. People rely on narratives, biases, or political preferences rather than measurable reality. But data, properly interpreted, cuts through the noise. It reveals trends that are invisible in daily life, yet incredibly important over long periods. Data exposes debt cycles, productivity shifts, demographic changes, inflation patterns, technological disruptions, and geopolitical realignments. It shows cause and effect relationships that emotional arguments usually ignore. When individuals and nations anchor decisions in data rather than emotions, they make fewer catastrophic mistakes. They also gain the ability to predict outcomes more accurately because history follows patterns driven by measurable forces. Data may not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces blind spots that often lead people and governments into crises they could have anticipated. Historical awareness strengthens this even further. When people study the rise and fall of past empires, they realize that today's events are not unprecedented. Similar moments have happened repeatedly. Economic booms, followed by debt crises, technological revolutions that disrupt old industries, internal divisions that weaken nations, and power shifts from one dominant country to another. History offers a map showing how other societies navigated similar transitions. What worked, what failed, and what choices led to disaster or renewal. Without historical awareness, people often misinterpret challenges as unique or unsolvable. They become fearful or overly optimistic, not understanding where they are within the larger cycle. But with knowledge of past patterns, individuals can stay calm, governments can stay strategic, and nations can avoid repeating avoidable mistakes. Clear principles also help people avoid the traps of bias, ego, and short-term thinking. During uncertain times, many react emotionally. They cling to ideology, blame others, or pursue quick fixes that create bigger problems later. Principles force a person to step outside their immediate feelings and see reality objectively. They create consistency in decision-making, which is especially important when external conditions are unpredictable. For nations, governing through principles leads to fairer systems, stronger institutions, and clearer policies. For individuals, it leads to better choices, less stress, and greater resilience. The ability to remain principled while everything around you changes is a defining factor in long-term success. Adaptation is equally important. Even the best principles and data are useless if a person or nation refuses to change. History shows that those who cling stubbornly to old ways decline, while those who adapt with flexibility rise. Adaptation means accepting uncomfortable truths, letting go of outdated assumptions, and embracing new strategies that match current reality. It means investing in education, innovation, partnerships, and technologies that will dominate the future rather than relying on what worked in the past. It requires humility, recognizing that no system, no nation, and no individual remains on top forever unless they evolve faster than the challenges they face. Ultimately, thriving in a changing world order demands a combination of clarity, discipline, and open-mindedness. It requires understanding the forces shaping the future, staying grounded in reality, and making decisions based on principles rather than fear. Those who practice this approach, whether individuals, organizations, or entire nations, are the ones who not only survive transitions but emerge stronger because they used the period of change as an opportunity for growth, reinvention, and renewed strength.